When my mom was in her mid-20s, around 1979, a few years before she married my dad, she was living with a friend in an apartment on a quiet but slightly run-down street in Jackson, Mississippi. Her roommate, a musician, had left town for the weekend and had told my mom she wouldn't be back until Monday, so my mom knew she would be alone for a few days. On Sunday night, as she went to bed, she couldn't shake a feeling of unease about being by herself. Just as she was starting to fall asleep, she suddenly heard a noise from the front room, like something rattling. Moments later, the front door creaked open. At first, she thought her roommate might have returned early, but the lights hadn't been turned on, and there was no familiar greeting. Instead, she heard quiet footsteps and things being moved around, and it dawned on her that someone else had entered the apartment. There was only one room separating her from the intruder, and she realized he was getting closer. She knew there was a back door near the kitchen, but it was always locked, and she didn't have a key to open it, making her feel trapped. Being a religious person, she began to pray, hoping for some kind of guidance. As she prayed, a sense of calm settled over her, and instead of panicking, she decided the best thing she could do was to stay perfectly still and silent, praying the intruder wouldn't notice her. My mom hoped the man would take the money from her purse and leave without bothering her. As she kept praying, she buried her face in her pillow, trying to stay calm despite the fear that made her entire body shake. Peeking out from under the pillow, she saw a large figure in the doorway. He was much taller than her fiancé, who was already 6 feet 4 inches, and his shadow loomed across the room as he stepped closer to her. Frozen in place, my mom didn't move, thinking her best chance was to pretend she was still asleep. The man stood at the foot of her bed, tilting his head from side to side as though trying to get a better look at her face. Terrified, my mom let out a loud scream, hoping someone would hear. After the scream, she realized the man had backed out of the room and exited through the front door, closing it behind him. Still shaking, my mom locked the door and turned on the lights, finally processing that this terrifying experience wasn't a dream. She called the police to report the break-in, and they told her the man had taken only a few dollars from her purse. When asked to identify him from a set of small photos showing just faces, my mom struggled because she hadn't seen his face clearly in the dark. After some thought, she chose one picture, though the detective assisting her seemed disappointed with her choice. He pointed to another man's photo and said, "I wish you had picked him instead. He's 6 feet 6 inches and was just released from prison last week. He lives 2 streets away." Though the man she picked wasn't conclusively identified, the incident haunted my mom. A few days later, she read a news story about a similar break-in nearby. To feel safer, she packed up her things and stayed with another friend for a few weeks, even though her roommate had returned. The fear lingered for a long time, and it was hard for her to relax or feel safe again in that apartment. My sister went to UCLA for her undergraduate studies, and during her first year, she chose to live in an apartment directly across from the LA National Cemetery. On move-in day, my dad and I helped her unpack and settle in, but after we left, my dad confided in me that he had seen something in the apartment that unsettled him, and he was worried about her staying there. For some context, my dad is a doctor, but he's also very religious and has had numerous strange experiences that can't easily be explained. Over the years, he's had premonitions that came true in exact detail, which often left the people around him feeling uneasy. He also claims to see things that most people would describe as paranormal, like spirits or demonic presences, and he says these encounters feel incredibly real to him. Fortunately, I didn't inherit his ability to sense or see these things. Anyway, my dad explained that the moment we walked into my sister's apartment, he noticed a dark shadow move quickly through the living room and slip out through the back window, causing the blinds to spread apart. He thought it might have been an animal, but when he checked, the window was completely closed and locked, which made him feel even more uneasy. To make matters worse, that window faced the cemetery. Over the next 2 years, my sister and her roommates experienced several strange, unexplained events. For instance, my sister would frequently hear her name being called from the living room, even when she was home alone. Sometimes, she would feel a cold breeze brush past her, even though all the windows were shut. Her roommates also reported hearing strange sounds, like footsteps in the hallway or items being moved around by themselves. Occasionally, they'd wake up in the middle of the night to the feeling of someone tapping or shaking their legs or whispering their names. One particularly eerie night while I was visiting, my sister's roommate invited us to her loft to show us something unusual. She stood in one spot in the room, and we could clearly see the hairs on her arms stand straight up, as if something invisible was there. But when she stepped away from that spot, the hairs would fall back down. She repeated this several times, and each time she crossed the boundary of that invisible force, the hairs on her arm would rise again, then drop when she moved away. It was incredibly creepy. The strange happenings weren't limited to my sister's apartment. Her neighbor also experienced odd things. The girl next door claimed she could actually see the spirit in my sister's apartment. When she visited, she would sometimes step aside suddenly, as if making room for someone to pass by, like she sensed a presence we couldn't see. This freaked my sister out, so she stopped inviting her over. That same neighbor once told a story about how her boyfriend, a strong, athletic guy, was shoved backward to the ground one day, as though something had tackled him. Another time, my sister was home alone and kept hearing her name being called from the upstairs loft, which made her incredibly uneasy. She was so scared that she called me, begging me to come over because she was too frightened to leave her bed. At the time, I was in college in San Diego, about a 2-hour drive away, and it was after midnight. I was at a party, but despite that, I decided to make the drive because I knew how truly haunted her place was. Thankfully, I didn't experience anything strange while I stayed with her that weekend, but my sister continued to feel like something was always watching her whenever she was alone in that apartment. I'm a 25-year-old woman who moved to a new part of town by myself with my dog back in November. The area has a trendy, hipster vibe, with lots of unique cafes, art galleries, and cool shops. Even though there's a bit more crime in this neighborhood compared to others, I still enjoy the atmosphere, especially with all the great bars, restaurants, and dog parks where my dog can play and socialize. I live alone in a 6-unit building on the ground floor, and I'm the only single person here, so it can feel a bit quiet at times. The building has a secure entrance in the front, but the back gate doesn't lock, so anyone could technically get in through the back door, which makes me a bit uneasy. Shortly after I moved in, my dog got really sick. She started having seizures every time she ate, which terrified me. I took her to the vet, but it was difficult to figure out what was wrong. I wasn't getting any sleep because she would throw up every 2 hours during the night, and I had to constantly clean up after her. It was an exhausting and stressful time, and I was incredibly worried about her. This went on for about 2 months until I finally took her to a better emergency vet clinic, where she had to stay overnight. I felt completely overwhelmed during that period, carrying her around, crying, and feeling helpless. When I took her to the clinic, they immediately admitted her for tests. I got home that evening around 7 p.m., feeling drained and anxious about what might happen to my dog. The vet kept calling me every 30 minutes to an hour with updates, so I stayed on edge. Around 1:15 a.m., just after I got off the phone with the vet, I heard noises at my back door. At first, I thought it could be the wind or something harmless, but it sounded like someone was jiggling the door handle, walking away, and then coming back to try it again. I didn't hesitate and called 911 at 1:29 a.m. The police arrived shortly after with about 10 officers and flashlights. They checked the apartment thoroughly, but no one was there, and nothing seemed out of place. While their presence made me feel a little safer, the experience left me shaken. 2 days later, I installed a Ring doorbell to monitor my door and have some peace of mind. I was so scared by what had happened that I stayed in a nearby hotel for 2 nights because I hadn't slept in over 36 hours. Despite everything, my landlord still hasn't added a guard to the back door or fixed the broken gate lock, so I decided not to pay my rent this month due to the safety issues. I received a notice warning me that I'll be charged late fees if I don't pay soon. The landlord has mentioned that I might have the option to move to another building and start a new lease there, which could be a good opportunity to find a safer place to live. They want to rent out my current unit, but I'm not sure what to do yet. It's a lot to process, especially after everything I've been through lately. This story starts back in 2012 and an old childhood friend invited me to be her roommate. I was eager to move out of my parents' house, and she needed help with rent, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity. The house we moved into was a small but charming cabin in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It had wooden walls, a front porch, and tall trees surrounding it. The cabin was old, possibly dating back to the 1700s. The road it was on was named after the family who originally owned the land, which is now part of a major U.S. city. If you search for American colonial cabin, you'll see pictures that resemble it. Initially, we thought the cabin might have been used as slave quarters due to the area's farming history, but we later learned it had been a stable. This theory seemed likely because our dog dug up a horseshoe in the yard, which I still have. On the night we moved in, the place already felt a little strange. There were no doors to the upstairs, which was my room, and none for the downstairs bedroom, which was an addition built in the 1980s. The previous owners had also added a kitchen and bathroom, as the original cabin lacked both. Now that you have a clear image of the house, here's why I'm sharing this story. From the moment I moved in, I felt like something was watching me. The house always seemed dark, cold, and damp, like a cellar, but it was more than just the age of the place. Something felt off. Every night as I lay in bed, I would wake up to the sound of scratching right beneath my bed, close to where my head was. It wasn't faint, it was loud enough to jolt me awake and made me feel uneasy. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from, and it happened every night. At first, I thought it might be mice, but as I listened more closely, I realized the scratching was long and slow, like something dragging for about a foot before repeating. I just hid under the covers, plugging my ears, not wanting to confront whatever it was. One night, though, I was still awake when the scratching started. This time, it began on the ceiling, far from my bed, and slowly made its way down the wall. Eventually, the sound was directly beneath me, and I could feel it right under my bed. It moved across the room and then back to the wall before suddenly stopping. That's when I knew it wasn't mice. The walls were solid wood, inside and out, with no gaps or spaces for animals to crawl through. The floor didn't have any space between the ceiling below and the floor above, so there was no logical way for any small creature to make such loud noises in solid wood. I was scared, so I started sleeping downstairs. My roommate, who is now my wife, noticed and asked me what was going on. I explained, and she said she had experienced the same things when she was home alone. This was just within the first week of us moving in. Now, here's the creepy part. When we first moved in, I had to remove screws from the windows that the previous tenant had installed, and there were piles of old mail-order catalogs for him. We used to joke that he was a reclusive Satanist, but now, I think we weren't too far off. Both of us started sleeping in the living room together, feeling safer that way. The strange atmosphere felt more bearable when we weren't alone. One night, I had a dream that a dark force was approaching me. It felt like I was watching myself sleep from a distance, and this dark figure loomed over me. I felt an intense pressure in my head, accompanied by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The feeling grew so overwhelming that I suddenly woke up, only to see the TV turn off a second later. We'd been having problems with the TV turning on and off randomly, but this time felt too eerie to ignore. I knew I had turned the TV off before going to bed, so why had it been on in the first place? After that, we started sleeping in her room, which was an addition to the house. My wife said nothing strange ever happened in there, which might be because it wasn't part of the original cabin. Strangely, it seemed like whatever was in the house had played matchmaker, as we've now been married for 5 years. One time, while I was upstairs reading and starting to doze off, the window began opening and closing by itself. I was fed up at that point, so the next day, I set up the same scenario to see if it would happen again, and it did. Frustrated, I yelled at the spirit, telling it to leave us alone because I was tired of dealing with its nonsense. After that, things quieted down for a while. However, when I was home alone, strange things would still happen, like alarm clocks going off after my wife left, drawers opening on their own, and loud banging on the front door. Over time, though, the strange occurrences slowed down and eventually stopped altogether. Now, the house feels normal, and I can spend time there alone without feeling uneasy. I hope it stays that way because I'd rather not deal with that creepy stuff ever again.